Do the honors and just get right into Star Wars and theology, finding the redemptive gospel themes that we can in there. Ramon?
Let's do it.
All right, so you have a book called Finding God in a Galaxy Far, Far Away, and this is a true story, Dr. Jones. When I was going through like a Christmas ago to buy a Christmas gift for Pastor Ramon's son, who's a big Star Wars fanatic, I went through a lot of the kind of Christian-themed Star Wars books, and I would preview them on Amazon, and they were just either cheesy or shallow or more mystical than evangelical. And so I was like, I'm not going to get any of these. These are either the people don't know the Bible or they don't know the Star Wars. You know, usually one of the two things happens, right? And then I found yours. I was like, oh, first of all, I know this guy from Misquoting Truth, the Bart Amron book you did. And then second of all, this actually looks really good. So I bought it as a Christmas gift for Ramon's son. And then I just read it myself. I bought it for myself last night. So it is, in my opinion, the best on the market in the ever-burgeoning field of evangelicals writing about Star Wars. Have you heard that before?
That's great. I mean, I've not heard that before, but I'm really, really glad to hear that, because that's what I wanted to really approach it as. It's not just something sort of shallow, weak, thin connections between the gospel and Star Wars, but really digging deeply into the rich meta-narrative that Star Wars presents that really makes it something that really kind of catches people's attention for generation after generation now.
What was so good about it is that you made it deep yet easy to read, and then it was, in a sense, thoughtful and deep, but it was where I think a lot of normal people could read it, and it didn't just deal with only like philosophical academic things. You kind of had man's existential crisis interwoven in there. And so I actually found it to be actually quite evangelistic. I imagine that was intentional, yes?
Yes, that was, and in fact, that's really was the central intention when I wrote that book. I was aiming for recognizing. At that point, I was part of a group that was for the game that came out several years ago called a Tactics. I don't know if you remember that, but it was like these Star Wars Tactics figures that were coming out, and I realized that Star Wars was giving me these really great opportunities in this group to jump off on some spiritual themes, and was able actually on this forum as part of this group that was of Star Wars people who were collecting miniatures and different things like that of Star Wars, was able actually to present the gospel in 2 or 3 instances in that, and it was starting out with the meta-narrative of Star Wars and then the real questions that raised and could lead to good gospel conversations. And so that the book kind of arose out of that type of context in which I was thinking, you know what, this could be bigger than just a few blog posts or a few posts on the forum here. This could be something where we can really, and so I really tried to start within it the sense of awe, because I think that's the shared point between the believer and the unbeliever. Calvin calls it the sensus divinitatis, and so that's what I'm thinking of when I'm working with that. I'm not saying that in the book, but that's what's in my mind. Calvin's sensus divinitatis. So I'm working with that as that common starting point that the believer and the unbeliever both sense in Star Wars, and then working outward from there to show that the gospel, the story of Jesus, is the consummate expression of that, and so to help it just kind of lead people along from that initial sense of awe all the way to the cross and to the empty tomb.
See, that's good. That's good.
So, and obviously, this is a much more positive engagement with Star Wars. I mean, there's another angle on this where you could almost analyze it as a more negative way. So, looking at the Force as kind of an Eastern approach to spirituality,
which is basically true. We would agree that it's basically true, though.
So, I mean, I'm just curious in terms of that angle of things. I mean, if that's if that angle is also in your mind, but you decided I'd rather sort of approach it from, as you just mentioned, and I like the way you put it, these kind of common touch points between the believer and the non-believer.
And that's right. Yeah, I mean, it's trying to approach it from that and from the sense of the meta-narrative. I think those are the areas, the meta-narrative and the sense of awe, that we can approach Star Wars. Because here's the interesting thing, is that Star Wars is not self-consistent. And what I mean by that is that, yes, it has an Eastern view of God. It has this very pantheistic Eastern view of God that is a force that fills all things and binds all things and all of that stuff like that. But yet, the fact that it's meta-narrative, narrative is very distinctly Judeo-Christian. That is to say, you have somebody who is redeemed through sacrifice. You have a good and wonderful past, the old republic when the Jedi weren't warriors. You've got this, golden past era. And then you have a fall, a very clear fall of the one who is good, the chosen one, falls deeply, and then the chosen one is redeemed by means of sacrifice, where Luke is willing to give his life for the sake of his father, and his father is brought back through that. That type of a linear meta narrative with a clear sense of redemption. So, in other words, if it were purely Eastern, it would be a cyclical meta narrative where it just all starts over again. But it has a linear meta narrative with a clear sense of sacrificial redemption and new life. That's impossible apart from a Judeo-Christian perspective. And so what we see in Star Wars is this mishmash of different spiritualities put together. And if we look at simply its view of God, its theology proper, we might say, it's thoroughly Eastern. And yet it can't tell a compelling story for the purely Eastern mindset. It's incapable of doing that. To tell a truly compelling story, it has to steal from, it has to borrow from a Judeo-Christian meta-narrative. Otherwise, the power, the gravitas that it has would never make sense apart from borrowing that Judeo-Christian type of meta-narrative.
Do you guys hear what's going on? What's he doing? He's doing an internal critique of the underlying philosophy, ethos, and theology of Star Wars. It's basically presuppositional apologetics and theology, in my view, applied to kind of a pop cultural, thing going on. But I agree, because you have people saying things such as Obi-Wan does in Revenge of the Sith, which everyone kind of points out as ridiculous. Only a Sith speaks in absolutes. Everyone can kind of see right away that is an absolute statement. And yet the very idea of the Force is that there is actually a good and a bad, or a light and a dark side. Now, though, they have trouble telling, is this yin and yang, or are we doing something else with it? And so I agree that there's a mishmash of it. In fact, you have a quote from George Lucas. Here's what he says, and I want to get your comment on this, maybe Vermome. I see Star Wars as taking all the issues that religion represents and trying to distill them down into a more modern and easily accessible construct. I put the Force into the movie in order to try to awaken a certain kind of spirituality in young people. I wanted to make it so that young people would begin to ask questions about the mystery.
Well, yeah, I mean, in many ways, that's a great opening for some of the things that we want to talk about, and I think that is done in this book. The idea of almost God has set eternity in our hearts. I mean, there's sort of echoes of that. Now, again, it's interesting, I think, how Lucas begins to unravel that or discuss that. And, I think many, I'm sure, being Star Wars fans, a lot of you guys are familiar with those interviews he did with Joseph Campbell.
Yeah,
so, so it's interesting, sort of his. But again, you get the sense Lucas is kind of searching, and you see the echoes of that in the work that he's doing. And I very much agree. It's speaking to probably the best thing in terms of our angle on these things is giving people a sense of the transcendent, right? It's the sense of something bigger than themselves. In some ways, you might say it's the atheist maybe who might have the most problem with Star Wars, because it's giving people a sense of something that exists outside of themselves.
So, ignorant question: do the atheists ever talk about Star Wars that way, or do they just enjoy it as a film?
Well, both. But I'll say two things, and then I'll let the expert actually comment. One is, this is from general anecdotal, so this is not scientific or anything like that. I've seen where atheists, especially the more hardcore ones, tend to be more Star Trek fans. And I think that's because of Roddenberry's humanism shining through a little more clearly.
Well, that's interesting.
Than Lucas's mixed up American Christianity with a light glaze of Zen Buddhism. That's my opinion, partially. Secondly, I feel like in some ways, Lucas went there a little bit with going towards a more materialistic worldview in the newer movies, because what he did is he rooted the Force in a biological reality. And so he rooted this supposedly mystical energy field in midi-chlorians. And to me, that's getting closer to a physicalist or materialist understanding of reality, because it used to be a mystical energy force that was created by living things, but there's definitely a mystery to it. I think some of that got sapped out a little bit. Dr. Jones, your opinion?
I think that second thing that you mentioned is exactly dead on, and that's why episodes 1 and 2 in particular are so sapped of that same sense of mysterious transcendence that you see in episodes 4, 5, and 6, is because he bought into modernity. Really, is what happens in that he bought into a materialistic, empirical mindset, and so the spirituality, which was left as a mystery in episodes 4, 5, and 6, he just guts it in episodes 1 and 2 in particular by doing that. And yet at the same time, what is fascinating, and again, it shows that from a presuppositionalist perspective, he can't live within his own worldview consistently. He begins to speak then in episodes 1 of 2 of the will of the force.
Yes.
You can't have both of those.
Yes, I was about to ask you that. Yes.
An impersonal reality, which is a materialistic reality, which is it has no personality, but rather is a panentheistic force. You can't have that and have a will from which prophecies come as well.
Because it's not a personal agent anymore. So how do you have the will of the force? No one speaks about the will of the rock or the will of the tree, because in philosophical terms, there's no what's called aboutness to them. That means they don't have any purpose for which they're directing their energies or thought patterns. They don't have a mental state property to them.
Maybe the midichlorians are like a hive personality. They're like ants. They move together.
You have to flesh that out. I don't know. And see, that's another important question. Is all of a sudden you have the will of the force. Not only that, but you have this concept of a chosen one. Chosen. Who's doing the choosing, guys? You see what I'm saying?
You're exactly. You hit all those things right there. And what we're seeing there is this clear sense in which it is impossible to tell a compelling story without borrowing from a Judeo-Christian worldview. That's what you see in this. You can't tell a compelling myth in the true sense of the word myth, where it's a story by which we interpret our lives and our circumstances and our worlds. You can't tell one that is compelling apart from some degree of borrowing from a Judeo-Christian worldview, and he can't pull it off. He just can't pull it off. And it really, the kind of the seams in his garment really begin to show in episodes 1 and 2 at that level.
Do you think that's true in general? This takes us a little out of Star Wars, but it does seem like a lot of our best stories essentially do borrow from that bigger story that God is telling.
That's exactly right. I think that's one of the clearest examples. For example, is the Dark Knight trilogy. The Dark Knight trilogy, where you have somebody who, at the end of the Dark Knight, he literally becomes the scapegoat for the sins of the city that he did not commit in that, and then he is broken. Literally, he is broken, and he is put that, and what does it say? Rise, rise, rise. And he rises again. That right there, you don't get much clearer of a retelling in a secularized format of the Christian meta-narrative than the Dark Knight trilogy. It's just not there. It's so clear in that we so deeply have woven within us this sense that once there was a world that was good, and then it has fallen, and we can call it Gotham, or we can call it the Empire, or whatever we want to. At that point, it still has that sense that we know that a world was once good, and the world was fallen, and that the world cannot be healed apart from sacrifice and new life. We know that, and our dreams are expressed most clearly when we understand that redemption is available only through sacrifice and new life, and that is the means by which a new world is born. And we see that in all of the most compelling stories all around us all the time, from the Avengers to the Dark Knight, to Star Wars, to Lord of the Rings. We see that story being played out, and we borrow from it, to get the best stories. And what was often unrealized is that whether it's Joss Whedon or whether it's Christopher Nolan or whoever it may be, they're pulling from a meta-narrative that was God's a long time before it was theirs.
Yeah.
Dr. Jones, do you think that Lucas or any of the other authors of these other movies and books expected someone like you and us to be discussing it from a Christian theological point of view, or would this catch them as, like, I don't know what they're talking about, I never thought about any of these things?
I think that George Lucas, my sense from him is that he expects that that is something that would be desirable, and that he wants that mystery to be explored and to be thought through and to be wrestled through. And so I think in some of the original forms of these stories, that there is a sense and an awareness of that. I do think that once it passes on from to different one, that the story itself has been at some level cut off from its original moorings, and it ends up being reformulated into different ways that sometimes get it, that sometimes recognize, that sometimes catch the sense, that original sense of the mystery and everything like that, and sometimes they miss it completely in that. But I do think at its origin with Lucas, I think he would expect that and perceive that. I don't think as it's traveled through different areas and everything like that it's exactly expressed in quite that same way.
Yeah, I wonder in the hands of J.J. Abrams what will happen with the philosophical and, to a certain extent, theological aspects that we're talking about. Because honestly, for me, I don't know enough about him. Like, I'm not the ultimate film critic or connoisseur, so I haven't followed his body of work. I mean, I know that he did the new Star Trek, for example, but I don't know exactly what he'll do with that. My general sense on what I know is it seems like it's possible that some of the Star Wars trappings may be back in full force. The sound and the feel and a lot of that might be back in full force, pun intended. But he seems to be, to me, a little bit more of a shallow filmmaker than Lucas at his best. And I could be wrong, but I'm not saying it won't be fun anymore as a movie, but I don't get the same sense that, he's reading Joseph Campbell's work, Hero with 1,000 Faces and Young Man's Journey and all that type of stuff in the same way that kind of the young wandering George Lucas was. What do you think about that, Dr. Jones?
All right, I fully expect on this in terms of what Abrams does with it, an inclination closer, more toward Star Trek than Star Wars. Now, that said, my higher hopes are, at the very least, that it will be more like Guardians of the Galaxy. That type of at least it gets that fun. That leaning more toward that type of a movie, that type of a fun that it has, that it could have in that. But I suspect to put it in a more theological way, I expect a more secularized vision out of J.J. Abrams. And I could be wrong. I kind of hope I am wrong, but I somehow expect a little bit more of that. But I will have to admit, from the trailers and all that I've seen, man, he does seem to capture a lot of the spirit of Star Wars. And so people have asked me what I said. I'm like, well, George Lucas, for good or for bad, set the bar so low in Episode 2 that it's going to be better. So that's the thing. I went and saw Episode 2 on opening night, and he set the bar so low at that point that it's going to be better in Episode 7, no matter what. And so anyway, so that's my take on that part as well.
I actually think that's probably right as well. With Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, there had been kind of a dark period of no Star Wars stuff because the internet hadn't been around in the late 80s. And it was kind of just getting its steam at that time. And so there was literally this dearth of Star Wars related stuff. And so into the mix, all of a sudden comes a new Star Wars movie. And it's hard to beat that anticipation. And also the movie itself was by many measures a bad movie. So I think on sort of the objective aesthetic aspect, I think we're going to beat that easily. Now, this is kind of weird. What's going on, guys? Let me explain this real quick. On Urban Theologian Radio, we're recording in December. The movie comes out this week. None of us have seen it yet, except Pastor Bob, who's personal friends with George Lucas and other Hollywood elite.
I wasn't going to tell you that, but I did see
right,
it.
But to you, it's just another day in the life of a G. But see, we at this time when this broadcast, the movie will have been out, and so I still not everyone will have seen it by then, though. Anyway, so we're talking about the larger universe as it is, though. But Pastor Ramon, what do you think of the old versus new and how the theology and philosophy is going to go or not?
Yeah, I'm somewhat more optimistic, but more because I think in some ways, I think Abrams is going to tap into blindly what we all liked about the original trilogy. I mean, when I read the things that he wants to sort of bring back and sort of the realism, the sense of mystery, the sense of lived-in universe, it's almost, I don't think he has as fully developed a worldview always has given as much thought to some of these kind of issues as George Lucas has. But I have a feeling that there's going to be a lot of echoes of the past for him to draw on. The interesting thing in all this is, of course, now we're looking at the beginning of really every year a Star Wars movie.
Or stuff,
I listened to this is going to really put out my nerd flag here on Star Wars. I periodically listen to this podcast called Star Wars Minute, where they analyze the Star Wars movies a minute at a time. It's pretty intense.
As I've said once before, I don't know if I'm impressed or rather discouraged to hear that.
It is pretty incredible. I don't listen to everyone, but the interesting thing when they mentioned in one of the recent podcasts that I happened to listen to is, we probably, if the Lord tarries, we'll die before knowing that there's more Star Wars movies to come. And so when you think about it that way, and sort of the way in which the canon is expanding, I think I say going all sorts of different directions. I mean, they're doing Rogue One. I forget the name of it. I forget the name of the particular movie. But it's the one that's going to be about how they found the Death Star plans, and
really?
So that's going to be more of like a realistic, almost like a wartime feel movie.
Oh, okay.
It feels as if like they're going all sorts of different directions and drawing all sorts of different themes. It'll be interesting to see how coherent it is. But I do agree with what Dr. Jones is saying, and this is really coming as a Christian, that like it or not, we all of us are created in the image of God, whether people admit that or not. And I think we, in various ways in the stories we tell, show echoes of that, even if we try to suppress it. And I think the best stories do that, and I think Disney will want to do that even if they don't subscribe to a Christian worldview.
So, Dr. Jones, when are you going to, this will have already happened when this airs, but when are you going to see it?
I have tickets for Thursday night, so the pre-release on Thursday night. So that's when I'm going to see it. I've gotten a whole row at the theater with reserved seating that I and another faculty member and some doctoral student were going to be going together to see that with my kids. So that's already been on the agenda ever since the day that the tickets were made available.
So Pastor Vermone and myself are going to see it together with our sons. Pastor Bob says he's not going to see a Star Wars movie until they make a version where Jabba the Hutt, and it's like told through his life story, kind of like the Godfather, the second Godfather movie, like to do Jabba the Hutt as a gangster, how he came up as a young slug, because he's a big Godfather fan, and so he said he won't see it until they do that, right, Pastor Bob?
Well, I didn't say that, but actually, I may adopt that view.
That sounds interesting. Yeah. But so I want to know this, Dr. Jones, who at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary is a legitimate Star Wars fan on faculty?
Oh, there'd be a handful. Rob Plummer, who's an eminent New Testament scholar, and he's a fan. And then Douglas Blunt, he just likes movies in general, and so he's a big fan of a lot of different movies and is interested in that in terms of philosophical and cultural engagement on that. So those are a couple that come to mind immediately who are pretty big Star Wars fans who, with me, enjoy it. I am the only one, though, who has an entire office decorated in Star Wars posters and toys, which is my office. And as I'm standing here right now, I'm looking at my refrigerator, which is Hansel and Carbonite refrigerator in my office. And so anyway, so
that is so that's seriously office. Impressive.
You know what I want to, and that's most impressive. You know what I want to see? Would you be down to take like a selfie for us of you in your office, and we could put it on our Twitter feed? And let people see what's going on in Dr. Jones's office. No one will. People will then wonder how you get any work done.
That's right.
Do you think Al Mohler?
And I've got my indoor village up here with my Ewoks hanging on it up here as well, on the corner of my desk here as well. So
that is great.
That's amazing. Do you think Al Mohler is going to see the new Star Wars movie?
I do not know whether he will see. He is, to say the least, not a Star Wars aficionado, to say the least. But I am sure, for the sake of cultural engagement, that he will see it at some point. I don't think I'm going to see him there on the opening night before the release.
Okay.
And that's like at midnight, right?
Right. Well, actually, they've got 7 o'clock and 10 o'clock showings, so we're going multiple times, going then and then the next Monday as well. So.
What about the Old Testament?
How many times will you see it, Dr. Jones?
I'm planning on 3 to 5, depending on, so 3 if it's bad and 5 if it's good. So,
see, you know what? This is a man after my own heart. So I saw the prequels all 3 times each because they were all pretty bad. But if it's good, it's probably going to be 5 times. And here's what's going on. I have a legitimate excuse this time, Pastor Bob. Listen to this. So I'm in my last year of the Talbot D-Min program, right? The name of it is Engaging Mind and Culture. And one of our assignments, this is true, that I have due in January under J.P. Moreland, he assigned this himself, is you have to write an analytical, philosophical, theological review of some pop culture phenomenon, such as some popular book, or especially they want people to mainly go after movies. So what do you think mine's going to be? It is going to be the Star Wars film. So I have to watch this movie.
Oh, multiple times,
yeah.
Not just once.
I won't be able to get it.
In the interest of the Academy and in the interest of your theology, you must watch it at least a half dozen times.
I mean, my naive question is, I don't see how 5 is enough.
Well, it depends how good it is.
That's great.
But okay, so okay, well let's
get into the book.
Yeah, back to the book. Back to the book. So there's one thing that I want to focus on a little bit, where you quote when they're training on the Millennium Falcon in the first movie, A New Hope, and in that part, Obi-Wan tells Luke, "Your eyes can deceive you. Don't trust them." First of all, that line right there, I want to explore for a few reasons. And then also at the end of the training, when Luke is able to block the laser blasts from the little remote without using his eyesight because the blast shield is down. With the blast shield down, I can't even see. How am I supposed to fight? You know, that line. That whole section, you have some interesting stuff that you write about in the book, your first step into a larger world. Can you discuss that at length?
Well, what I'm trying to get at in that is simply, and again, my intent is to engage with the unbeliever, and I want them to recognize the foolishness of only believing in the world your eyes can see. That's really what I want to impress on them. And what's kind of undergirding that for me is that type of a drive in that the fact is that none of us lives by precisely and only what we can see with our eyes, what we can see and touch and taste and feel. We don't live that way. We can't live meaningful and flourishing lives in that way. And so what I want people to see is the value and the importance of that which you cannot see. And I want to impress in them from the standpoint at that point of common grace, of how we ought to be living with a recognition of awe and wonder around us all the time. And once again, I'm just convinced that every single person senses this at some level. They have this yearning at times. They feel that, they sense that. And I want them to see that that matters, and that that's not simply this kind of empty pining that's left over from some sort of an evolutionary, nascent sense from some time in the distant past, that rather this is something where you are yearning for what is real, what is true, what is the awe, the wonder of the world in which you live. And so what I'm wanting people to do early on at that point is recognize that, to welcome that, to embrace that, because I do believe that that's what awakens something in us to do with in Star Wars, but also it can awaken something in us. God can use that by His grace, by His power. He can use that sense within us to guide us, to aim us toward the cross of Jesus Christ ultimately. And what's kind of in my mind going on at that point right there, there's something that Calvin does, particularly in the Institutes, but he also does it in his commentary on John, in which he speaks simultaneously of the sensus divinitatis. He'll say at the one time, the sense of divinity, this awareness of the divine. He'll say at one point that it's a fountain of idolatry. It produces all sorts of rebellion and idolatry and all that. And then in another spot, Calvin will say that it becomes this fountain of our worship, and apart from the fall, it would lead us all the way to God and all the way to Christ. And it's, how does he speak so much about the same reality as doing two different things? Well, the fact is that what he's recognizing is that the same reality within us that before grace is this yearning that leads us to idolatry. When God reaches in and God works by His grace and transforms us, that is the conduit by which we are led to run to Him in worship and in praise. And so what I'm wanting to do in that is to evoke that sense of awe and wonder. And I know that I can't cause their heart to be awakened to God's grace. I can't cause a dead soul to be made alive. But what I can do is present something in which it provides an opportunity. It provides something where God can work and God can open someone's mind that then they see, wow, I do have this sense of awe, and it's supposed to lead me to something beyond myself and beyond the world I see. And that begins, that's that point at which God working in them hopefully will lead them toward, will aim them toward what he desires for them, and will ultimately lead them toward trust in Christ and a recognition that only in him is their longing for awe and wonder and majesty ultimately fulfilled.
Let me read a quote from the book. And here's the best part. I don't have to run to a galaxy far, far away to find this larger world. When I open my life to the glory of God, this larger world already surrounds me, filling my ordinary life with indescribable wonder. Well, listen, this is the show of all shows. We could do this show forever and a day. But I want to try to hit a couple more things because we've actually got to get out of here in a second, which is, here's the question I want to ask you, Dr. Jones. Is Qui-Gon Jinn a Calvinist? Here's why I asked that. Our meeting was not a coincidence.
This is going to be good.
Nothing happens by accident. He said that. What's going on? Is he like a reformed Jedi?
And Obi-Wan Kenobi, he is, but has this strong sense of providence as well, where he says to Han Solo, in my experience, there's no such thing as luck. Well, yeah. Obi-Wan Kenobi is no Pelagian, and if so, he's barely an Arminian if he is. And so at that point, so I think that's a supreme example. You hit it right there of that, again, that inconsistency in George Lucas's worldview. Because he's this supposed thing, where the Force, it obeys, it not only creates your reality, but it obeys your commands, all those things like this. The Force is somehow malleable, and the future is always in motion, as Yoda says, always in in motion the future is. All those things like that are very Eastern. And yet then you have these times there's no such thing as luck. Well, it would seem if there were two equal powers of dark and light warring with one another, that there could be some luck involved at some point in that. And our meeting was not a coincidence. It was by the will of the Force. Yeah. That sounds an awful lot like there's some degree of providential sovereignty at work as well. And so in the midst of that, you see that once again of this clear thing that he can't live consistently within his own worldview. These ideas of providence, these ideas of a plan, of a chosen one, they crop up in spite of themselves. You see in that, those are the holes in the boat through which the truth leaks in spite of itself. And that's what you're seeing, I think, in those points are where that's happening in George Lucas's worldview.
Yeah, because understand, if the Force is able to be manipulated by Force users, that's even the technical terminology within the expanded universe and all that, a person can use it and bend it to their will. So if you have evil desires, you use the Force to choke people or to send lightning out of your fingertips. If you notice, those are two powers that Jedi never do. They never display or exhibit those Force abilities, not because they couldn't, because those are actually dark side powers to choke somebody. And that's where they get into this idea of when Luke choked the Gamorrean guards when he's going into Jabba's palace, he was like kind of tapping, he was starting to actually tap a little bit into his anger and hatred. And he has all black on, and the Emperor recognizes that as well. And but in general, that doesn't seem like the way they're supposed to go. So it's a conflict. It's a self-destructive thing to think the Force has no personality. It's not personal. In fact, it's just created by biological life. But yet somehow it has a will, and it's able to, through some type of medium, make prophecies, choose people, all these types of things. And so you do see those two things in conflict there. Pastor Bob, did you know that this type of analysis could happen?
I did not.
And I bet you're glad. Well, this is the last thing I want to ask you about, Dr. Jones, is then what about Anakin? Because what he seems to want to do is to not sort of trust in providence, if you want to call it that, but he himself wants to be in total control. For example, why couldn't I save her? I know I could have. Padme says, Annie, you tried Sometimes there are things no one can fix. You're not all powerful, Anakin. But I should be, and someday I will be. I will be the most powerful Jedi ever. I will even learn to stop people from dying. So he wants to be in control, and he's not. Is that why he becomes Darth Vader? Because he's an Arminian?
I think he is.
So you never thought of that either, have you?
At that point, although I do like that idea, I need to explore that further. But I think what is the nearest analogy we have to that is Adam prior to the fall. That is to say, of Adam and Eve wanting that life or that knowledge that has been forbidden them. They desire that for the sake of power. You shall be as God. And so I think in that you have this kind of, to use Augustine's term, able to sin, able not to sin, in there where he is on that threshold that he chooses to take that which is not rightfully his. He chooses to seek that. And just as in Adam and Eve, what you find when he does that is that rather than it bringing him satisfaction and flourishing and joy and life, what it actually brings him instead is death and destruction and tragedy. And so I would place, in terms of an analogy in the biblical meta-narrative, I think Anakin really does have that sense of he wants to be God. I mean, that's what he's wanting. He wants to be all-powerful. He wants to be omnipotent. He wants to control life and death. That's what he desires. That's what he longs for in that. And so in the midst of that, what you see is a very clear picture of the fall in some sense. In Anakin at that point. And so I was trying to think through. I suppose that you could make a case for him being at some level, maybe even. I was trying to refresh my mind of the Pelagius's view of the fall at that point, and believing that every individual, in some sense, reenacts the fall of Adam in that. And so we might be able to even accuse him of a bit of Pelagianism there if we wanted to really stretch it and work at it. But nonetheless, I do think that's what we see in Anakin is this Adamic fall is what we really see in him, with many of the same motivations that we see in that.
So let me give people an idea of part of what we're doing here. We're not saying that Star Wars is Christian. We're not saying that all the worldview aspects in it are good. Hopefully you can already see that. If you've been listening to the show, hopefully you understand. We're doing more like a total analysis. There's internal critique. But yet, we also see there's gospel themes that we can talk about and ask, why does that resonate with people? And so this is not there's kind of an old school knee-jerk reaction where, you see the Gnosticism or the Hinduism or the Buddhism or the Taoism or the occultism in Star Wars, and you automatically write it off. Like, I think you can say, okay, I see that. Now, I also see these themes of redemption, and I also see some of those other things that you were mentioning, and we can see those as well and bring them both and say, okay, let's do a worldview analysis. I think that's a more helpful way. In my opinion, you can do that with a lot of art. I think when art gets to the grotesque or the obscene or something like that, then there's different questions you have to ask as if it should be passing through your mind, basically. But I think that's helpful. I mean, Dr. Jones, maybe final comments about what we're trying to do here and that type of thing in general, that project.
I often use and I've borrowed this from a couple of different sources, but the idea of a thin reading versus a thick reading of something.
Good.
And I think there's two different thin readings that we can take as Christians. On the one hand is the one you mentioned, the thin reading of seeing, okay, there's bad things in this, or there are things that are not theologically correct in this. Probably George Lucas cannot sign off on the canons of Dort without his fingers crossed, so therefore we're going to reject this. We're just going to push this aside. That's a thin reading. And what you mentioned about, there's Eastern religion and all of that, that's a thin reading that looks at it at the surface level of it and rejects it. There's another type of thin reading we can do of literary artifacts as well as artistic expressions such as Star Wars. And that is where we try to make surface level connections that really end up becoming forced. I remember, and no pun intended on it being forced at that point. But I remember when Star Wars first came out, and I was 5 years old when I saw it, and I saw a book at the Christian bookstore that I absolutely had to have just because it was in the Christian bookstore, so it must be awesome, and it must be okay, and it had something about Star Wars on the front, but it was called something like The Gospel of Star Wars or something like that. And I remember this book, as I was 6, 7 years old, and I read it. It was aimed at adults, but I read this book. But what it did, it had this chart in it in which Luke Skywalker equals Jesus. Darth Vader equals devil, and it goes all through all these things that had connected it in this way. But that got super awkward when the second movie came out, and you realize that that Darth Vader is Luke's father, and that doesn't really work at that point. And that's the type of mishmash we get when we do a thin reading on the positive side of things. So what we really need to do is not a thin reading that rejects, nor a thin reading that uncritically accepts. Both of those don't really take either the art or the theology seriously at that point. We need to do a thick reading of text and a thick viewing of movies. What I mean by that is where we look not simply at those surface level connections, but at the deep meta narrative that it is telling. So one of the easiest ways just to start through this, I do this with my kids, and sometimes they hate it because I make them think through these things in movies. But I go through creation, fall, redemption, and new creation. And so I just ask, what in this movie, in light of God's creation, what was the good and the beautiful in this movie? And it might be something artistic, something that's just seen that was just gorgeous, or something in which there was some sense of what was good in it. Where is that? And then under fall, I ask first that surface level of what are things in this movie that we shouldn't imitate, that this is not what we ought to imitate. But then I go dig deeper and ask, are there any lies that this movie is trying to tell us about reality? That's evidence of the fall. Are there lies that it's trying to tell us? Then I ask, redemption. Okay, in light of what does this movie think it takes to make the world right? That's the way I ask the question typically. What do you think that in this movie it tries to tell us makes the world right? And then about new creation is, what is this movie's dream for the future of the way life ought to be in the future? What is the dream of this movie in that? And so I think that's a thick reading, a thick understanding of it. And that's how we need to approach Star Wars as well as anything else, where we say, okay, what is the good in it? What is the good and the beautiful? What are the things that are just not worthy of imitation? And some movies have so much stuff that's not worthy of imitation that we just need to avoid it completely. There are movies that are that way, and television shows that are that way. But then every one of them is trying to tell us some sort of lie about reality. And it's also trying to tell us what makes the world right and what the world ought to be. And so when we look at it in terms of the big picture of God's meta-narrative, that's when we can do a thick and rich and deep reading and understanding of cultural artifacts and cultural narratives so that we can engage them intelligently and not simply at a surface level of engagement.
That's good. That's good talk right there. Well, I wish we could do this all day. In fact, Ramon, couldn't you easily see a new podcast being started?
Let's make it happen.
I mean, and who would be our frequent contributor? It'd be Dr. Jones. Bob, we'd let you hang out with us still, if you wanted to be part of it, but
that'd be great.
That'd be great. All right, hey, thanks again for joining today. Tell people how they can find your stuff real quick.
All right, just go to timothypauljones.com. That's my website, timothypauljones.com, and click on books, and they can find pretty much everything right there.
Should we tell him?
Great to be with you.
Should we tell him, may the force be with you?
I think
I'm going to tell you a story if you've got time for that.
That'd be a thin comment, I would say.
All right, here's our story. This is our closing story, everyone. Let's turn up the music for this story. All right, we're in.
So we're at Disney World, and we're on the Star Wars ride right there. And at our church, we say, "Peace be with you," and everybody responds, "And also with you." And we're getting off the Disney World ride, and my youngest daughter, they're all saying, "May the force be with you. May the force be with you." So she just puts her hand up like we do in terms of at church, and says, "And also with you."
Yeah.
So that's
funny.
Called a liturgically formed response.
That
right
is
there.
really funny.
At that point.
I like that. Ramon actually was working on making a Jedi catechism the other day. I'm just kidding. That's a joke too. But the best line out of today's show where he said, just because George Lucas can't sign off on the Canons of Dort without his fingers crossed behind his back. Did you guys catch that?
Yeah, that was good.
Like that, you got to use that again somewhere, okay? All right. Well, this will air January is when people are listening to it, and we're excited. And then maybe we can do another show sometime about an analysis of the new movie, and we might call you to do that. Thank you for joining us today.
Great.
All right, God bless. May the force be with you. Guys, we got
you.
All right, man. Let's take off. Today we are going to be talking about the theology of You know what that is, Bob?
Let me see. Is it Batman?
Gospel themes in the Star Wars universe.
Oh, Star Wars.
And we're going to be having Dr. Jones. I'll tell you a little bit more about him in a second, but for now, let me put that on hold. Doesn't it sound beautiful?
Well, that's the
Yes.
that's the far, far away, right?
Yes. Okay, but you know, right now, Pastor Bob, we've got to read some listener feedback first, so I'm going to have to put that on mute for just a second.